Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's community forum. Thank you very much, Nanette. Good evening. My name is Aaron Townsend, and I am the Assistant Superintendent of School Management for Portland Public Schools. Welcome to tonight's community forum regarding the recent student protests at Lincoln Middle School. Tonight is the first of two events as we close the year to engage around what happened that day, the issues that students were raising, and opportunities for us to be able to engage and share information and engage in dialogue about those issues. So the purpose of tonight's, as you see here, is to just build shared understanding about the events that happened that day, to provide some updates on some of the initial follow-up moves that have taken place, and to communicate information about the administrative supports in place through the end of the year. At the end tonight, we'll remind that we are hosting a community dialogue, which will be a chance for all members of the community to come together on Thursday, June 9th, to have a lot more discussion and interaction around these issues and around how we move forward as a community at Lincoln Middle School. So tonight, we hope that you'll use the Q&A, where we'll go through in a minute to share some information, around these three goals. And then we'll open it up using the Q&A function within Zoom to take questions and respond about any of the issues surrounding the protests and the follow-up events and anything related to Lincoln. So please use that as we go through this evening, and if you have questions. And again, we invite everybody to come to the community dialogue on Thursday the 9th for an opportunity to dig in deeper and engage as members of the community with one another around these issues. So tonight, we are joined by Superintendent Javier Botana. Again, my name's Aaron Townsend, and I'm the Assistant Superintendent of School Management. We have with us tonight Kathy Marquis-Gerard, who was our interim assistant principal and is currently our acting principal as we close the year, as well as Gavin Goodall, who is our current now acting assistant principal to close the year. So we'll talk more about their roles a little later in the evening. And we want to thank the multilingual team for being here to provide language supports, and welcome as well Malia Nali, who is our assistant superintendent of teaching and learning, who's with us this evening as well. So with that, before we move into that, I will turn it over to Superintendent Botana to begin to kind of talk us through a little bit about the things that led up to the protest and the protest day itself, and to share some of the information about how things transpired. Superintendent?
Thank you, Aaron, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. We recognize that this is not the way that anybody wanted to end the school year. And so, as the leader of the school district, I apologetic and feel terrible about the fact that we are here at the end of the school year having to have this conversation today. I do think that I want to thank the Lincoln Middle School PTO and faculty and others for coming together and trying to figure out how to leverage this as an opportunity to continue to move the school's work forward. But I do want to start by recognizing that it's not a situation that any of us would want to be in and having to have this discussion. My role today is to talk a little bit about the sort of the understanding that we have of the issues leading up to the protest, the actual events at the protest, and then some of the underlying issues that have surfaced as a result of the protests that we are committed to addressing as part of the work of moving Lincoln Middle School as part of Portland Public Schools forward. So unlike the protests that happened on the same day at Moore Middle School, we had very short warning about the protests that eventually unfolded at Lincoln. We learned about it late Sunday, early Monday of that week. And, we began, as we were at the same time working with Moore, to try to find a way to honor the voices and elevate the voices of our students, while at the same time recognizing that not all students shared the perspectives that were bringing about the protest, and not all students or their families would want them to participate. So the first level of efforts that were made early in the week were to try to understand what were some of the underlying issues, and the administration at Lincoln convened a series of forums with groups of students, as well as conducted a survey. And up until the middle of the week, thought that we were in a position where the students did not feel that they needed to continue with the walkout, that they were getting the type of opportunities to share their insights that would warrant them not walking out, instead moving directly to the work that we're committed to do, which is to address the concerns that were being raised. Late in the week, we learned that that was not the case, and then we worked with the administration to set parameters, boundaries around what the protest would look like, to ensure that we could, one, keep our students safe and make choice for participation or not participation a viable option for all students. And then, also wanting to ensure that the students who were leading the protest and were organizing the protest understood some of the key elements of working to push against the system, and so having to engage with us around what the rules of engagement would be for the protest. So that was developed. It was agreed that we would allow the students to walk out for a period of time on the morning of the 13th, and that they would be expected to come back into the building after that time was over. And knowing that we could not manage to ensure that students who stayed out would stay on grounds through the entire day, recognizing that parents may have sent their kids to school with the understanding that they were going to protest and then go back inside, or maybe they weren't even allowed to protest, but their students had still gone on to protest. We had told families that we would communicate with them as soon as the protest was over, to let them know that if they got a robocall that communicated that their student was absent, that means that the student did not come back. And we were doing that for a couple of reasons. One, we couldn't ensure that the kids would, be there and stay on campus, so they could wander off and something, could happen to them. And we wanted to make sure that parents knew that their student was participating in the protest past the time where the protest was sanctioned. We, as part of laying out parameters for the students, gave them a time frame. That's not an infrequent thing for, I'm sorry, I'm going way too fast for our interpreters. Sorry about that. We gave them parameters for the protest because we wanted to help them to understand that when you do a protest, you have to get a permit. The permit is for certain places and certain times. And so that was a part of the reason. And we also wanted them to understand that there would be potential consequences for staying outside of those boundaries. And so the idea was that the sanction for not returning would be that your parents would be informed and you would be marked absent. You would miss on whatever was happening in the school on that day as a result of missing the protest. So that was the set of circumstances leading up to the actual protest. On the day of the protest, things proceeded the way that we expected at the beginning of the day, but things did not continue as the protest went on. There were behaviors during the protest that were not consistent with the parameters that had been outlined, particularly the yelling and calling out specific staff. And as a result, there was, during that time, the interim principal and the two school secretaries left the premises and left us basically without the ability to do some of the other things that we had committed to doing, such as communicating with families shortly after the time for the protest was up, that their child was still out protesting. That did not actually happen until much later in the day. Our intent was for parents, when they received that information, to communicate with their student, to communicate with the school, to let us know that their child needed to return to school or actually come themselves and bring the student in. Because our communication did not go as planned, there were other circumstances on the ground that occurred that made the staff feel uncomfortable, fearful of allowing the students back into the building, and decided in the moment not to allow students to come back into the building. There was a great deal of misinformation that happened at that time, with some students being told that they would be suspended, for some students not being allowed back in the building, while other students were being allowed into the building. And so that is where I would say that our plan completely came off the rails. So that's the accounting of what happened on the day of. And we're going to spend more time talking about the subsequent work, but I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about what was motivating and energizing the students to walk out and to make their voices heard in the way that they went about doing it. And that is, that sort of falls into a couple of categories. And as I've done these conversations with students at Lincoln, but also have had those conversations with students at Moore and students at King, the themes are remarkably consistent, and they have to do with a couple of things. One is the general sense that students are not respectful of each other consistently. And so there is a significant amount of name calling that, in the case of students who are not, white, cisgender, and so on, are clearly what we would consider to be slurs, and that students experience that, and they experience that bringing that information to staff at our schools, whether it be their classroom teacher, their crew, or advisory teacher, or the administration, is not always met with the level of attention and the level of follow through that they would expect, given the seriousness of those situations. The other thing that they bring to our attention is that oftentimes they feel that the students who bring those charges or those situations forward are either ignored or minimized, and sometimes are actually blamed or, we attempt to keep them from experiencing it the way that they're experiencing by, in essence, telling them, that the student who did it didn't mean it, didn't understand what they were doing, things along those lines. And so that gives a strong sense of alienation and that we're not responsive to their well-being when they're bringing us things forward. They also feel that they tend to get disciplined more heavily than students who bring those than the students who actually do the name calling. So I've heard from students who have said that, as a Black student, I call another Black student the N-word, and I get a detention, and a white student who calls me the N-word gets a talking to. And so those are the kinds of things that students brought forward. In addition to that, the disparities in discipline and, the general sense of not being trusted, of being followed, of being always assumed to be doing something wrong are, prevalent experiences that our students have brought forward in our subsequent conversations. Those are things that we are, unfortunately, they're not news. Many of our surveys and other data collection mechanisms, whether it's our discipline data or our attendance data and things along those lines, show us, across the board that the experiences of our students of color, our students who are LGBTQ plus, are not the same as the norm in our school system. So those are, very serious issues that we've committed to working through and, with renewed energy and urgency as a result of these conversations. So that is, in a nutshell, what happened leading up to, during, and sort of the underlying reasons for the protests. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Aaron to take us to the next step.
Thank you, Superintendent Botana. And as a reminder, if you have questions or want clarifications about anything that we've shared, please use the question and answer feature. You can begin to put questions in there, and we'll work through those in a few moments once we wrap up kind of presenting and sharing some of this information. So feel free to start entering questions if any of them are coming up for you. So since that day, we have taken some initial steps to be able to respond to the concerns that students were bringing forward, and to create space to listen and understand their asks and begin to develop supports. We similarly have engaged staff in some listening opportunities to be able to understand how to support them in their commitment to support students and address the issues that the students were bringing forward. So the Superintendent Botana mentioned an initial survey prior to the protests. So following that, we expanded that to provide the opportunity initially that had been focused at the 8th grade, and we expanded that to provide all students the opportunity to provide input about their experiences and to be able to identify ways they'd like to engage moving forward around these issues. That's led a large number of students indicated that they were interested in various focus groups to be able to continue the dialogues about the issues that were being raised and their experiences around school. So those were grouped in somewhat thematically, but often touched on ranges of issues. But students who may have been focused on talking about bullying issues, or issues related to race, or issues related to homophobia or transphobia. So we have done another initial round just this past week based on that data of additional focus groups to create space for students to talk about those issues as one of our next steps. We are also partnering with the organization Seeds of Peace, with whom Portland Public Schools has had a long, productive relationship around engaging around these issues to be able to create groups at the school for students to be able to continue some of these dialogues as we move forward. Additionally, in the few days following the protests, recognizing also the need for our staff to speak and process their experience, we've held listening sessions with staff on Monday and Tuesday of last week, and had an initial kind of staff professional development and meeting on Wednesday of last week to continue to process this and have conversations about how we move forward. So we've been working to engage, both of those core groups of our Lincoln Middle School community to deepen our shared understanding about the issues at play and how we might begin to move forward to meet their needs. So some of the things that we have begun to hear, and we believe this is an ongoing process. So these are some of the initial things as we're closing this year that help us to both provide supports in the immediate, but also to plan ahead for the coming school year. So similar to how Superintendent Botana reflected around, the needs that students have expressed across our middle schools, we heard clearly from groups of students that their first and kind of most basic ask and kind of demand is to be believed and heard and to kind of be respected in that way as a foundational way of operating as a school community. They also wanted to have more opportunities to discuss issues of racism, bullying, and harassment based on various identities and other issues. So we've begun, as I've said, to take some of those steps, but recognize that that's an ongoing body of work that we need to hold and plan for as we move forward. And they had as well some specific asks. And Lincoln is a school community in which there have been some student groups, such as SAGA, the Straight and Gay Alliance, and a civil rights team. But specifically, they wanted to continue to expand those student groups by establishing groups such as a Black Student Union, built off some of the structures that we have had at our high schools and have begun to grow at our middle schools. So we were fortunate, one of our teachers, faculty members at Lincoln, hosted last Friday some high school students from Deering that are leaders of the Black Student Union to begin that work to establish a chapter at Lincoln Middle School. As we engaged with staff, again, we heard some kind of parallel supports and desires for how to move forward. So one was kind of a clear interest and desire to be dialoguing with students about these issues and wanting to have ongoing kind of training and support to do so productively. So we look forward to continuing to build off some of our initial conversations to help hold that space and meet both student and staff needs to continue to process these issues and create safe and welcoming environments for all students and staff. And then they expressed a desire to kind of end the year, given the protests and the many challenges throughout the year. We recognize that the protest in some respects reflected a culmination of frustrations and challenges that students had experienced and know that staff have been managing throughout the year. And so the goal was to end the year with some healing and to develop a vision for the coming year with ongoing supports from us at the central office in that work as we close the year and move into the coming year. So we appreciated the directness and honesty and courage that our students have demonstrated throughout this process. And again, feel sad and, that, this is where we are, but taking this as an opportunity to begin to move forward, and appreciate the staff at Lincoln and their desire to create space for students to hold these conversations and to be able to grow together as a school community. So we wanted to also just share a few additional notes about, the supports that we've put in place to help manage to the end of the year, recognizing, that, interim principal Bailey and a couple of the secretaries are on leave. So we have organized the following support. So we've appreciated Ms. Marquis Gerard's, support throughout the year, initially as interim assistant principal, and stepping into the role of acting principal as we're closing the year, helping to lead some of the school-wide planning work to prepare for the coming year, including our hiring work, scheduling, coordinating with the rest of the staff around end-of-the-year events to ensure that we are kind of closing the year in a productive way and setting ourselves up for success in the coming year. Additionally, Gavin Goodall, who's with us tonight, as I said, is the acting assistant principal. Gavin actually is a member of our central office team as our executive director of data and information technology, but he brings to the work experience both as a teacher and school leader, and so we're excited and appreciate his ability to pivot for these last few weeks of school, to step in, as the acting assistant principal, as we continue to respond to student needs and to support staff through these last few weeks. Additionally, we've prioritized time from a few of our other central office staff to be able to provide some of the supports, that students and staff need to help meet the goals that students and staff articulated for how to end the year. So Barrett Wilkinson is our district-wide director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he is spending about half of his time for the remainder of the year at Lincoln, providing support around restorative justice work to continue to grow that effort, in these final few weeks to build a culture that, again, supports all students and creates pathways for them to be successful. Chris Reiger, as well, from the central office, is spending some focused time with our student support team, our counselors, our social worker, and some of the other support staff that's engaged in kind of behavioral supports to help ensure we're expanding and providing the right kinds of groups and interventions to be able to meet students' needs and to ensure that that's coordinated. And then myself, I am, in general, spending, a significant amount of my time on an ongoing basis supporting them, supporting the Lincoln community. So I'm spending kind of up to or more than a couple of days a week at the school as well, as we're closing the year and trying to help manage this transition, from, through the remainder of this year and into the coming year with our incoming principal, Marissa Ayala, who, I've been in contact with as events have been unfolding and as we are planning and preparing for the coming year. So there have been as well. So those are some of the additional supports and changes. I want to as well recognize many incredible staff members who have stepped up in this difficult time to be there for students and recognize, that we have, a core group of staff at Lincoln that is committed to participating in this work, being leaders themselves in it, to meet the demands of students, to respect and hear them, and to kind of grow the school community as we move forward. So with that, I want to again remind, and we'll get to question and answers in just a moment, but remind that tonight, the goals of tonight were to kind of meet the needs of sharing information, clarifying things, so that we can invite everyone to a community dialogue on Thursday, June 9th in the evening. It'll be hosted in person at Lincoln Middle School. We were glad to be able to do those kinds of in-person events again. And we're going to partner with Portland Empowered to use a structure that has been used throughout the district that facilitates dialogue around key issues such as the ones, that are incredibly present, at Lincoln. So it's called the Shared Space Cafe, and has been a productive structure for dialogue among community members to kind of hear their concerns, to be able to create space for folks to give voice to their own concerns and interests, and to be able to help us, kind of process and move forward. So in a moment, I will pop the kind of blast the RSVP link just so we can plan. Anybody is welcome, even if they haven't RSVP'd, but it'll help us, try and be prepared for the kind of turnout that we may have that evening. So with that, I'd like to pause for a minute, and we'll take stock of some of the questions, and kind of work through those to try and meet our goal of clarifications and sharing information. So let me first pop the chat in, or the RSVP link. Okay. So I'll work kind of from the top. So the first question was around what groups of students were consulted the week of the protest. And I don't know if Kathy, so I'll open that up, I know that there were a targeted group of 8th grade students who, we had understood were primarily interested in kind of the protest. So these were primarily BIPOC students, as I understood, students who identified as students of color in some fashion. And so those were some of the initial groups and conversations that happened the week prior to the protest. Since that time, that's grown and expanded significantly in terms of the students who have engaged in the focus groups that have followed.
And I would add, I was not part of the conversations going into it. That was Robin was doing that, but I think that with the time frame, there wasn't enough time to involve all the students. I think we were getting information back from the survey, and then also from the focus groups that had started. So I think now I think it's become much more inclusionary and much more representative of the groups that we have here at Lincoln.
Yeah.
Did was the survey for all students, or was it just for 8th grade?
The survey started with just the 8th grade at the time. Yes. Yeah. And then there was some changeover to include everybody. But yeah, it started with the 8th graders, and that was the vocal group. And that's where the leadership was coming from. And I think they had heard what was going on over at Lyman Moore and really wanted to participate. That group over there had, I think, more time to organize and had a different format. But the kids were really saw it as an opportunity that they wanted to have. And so that was the kind of the impetus for putting one together. So it's good.
Great. There was I'll take this as a clarifying question and just kind of, repeat it back. So during the protest, the principal and 2 secretaries, left the school and didn't come back. And yes, that was, how things transpired that day. There's a question around what happens to the staff who misled students about facing suspension. What consequences do they face? I think, it was, again, in the spirit of kind of restorative work, and recognizing, that given the short time frame, the communication and clarity and subsequent, just kind of transitions that happened during the day, that there was a lot of confusion. And so our approach has not been to kind of seek out and identify who those individuals were, but to work towards clarifying with accurate information, communicating with students, and with families more broadly, what the real expectations were, to try and, clear up any of that confusion, beyond trying to manage investigation to identify specifically where that misinformation may have come from, because we recognize, in the time frame, that it was a challenging turnaround to ensure, the clarity of information being pushed out.
Yeah, and I would add that when approached with that information and asked that, I responded, no, that wasn't any part of the conversation that I'd been part of. But I also think I wasn't sure if that was coming from students talking about one another and saying that was going to happen, or the adults did at that point. But at that point, I tried to, let them know that that wasn't the conversation that was going on from the administrative end. So, or at least from my end. So,
yeah. One, I guess more of a comment, but just to give voice to it here, and, offers, allow space for any kind of response. So a comment from that says it would have been very helpful to have more formal context from the school on what the students were stating as issues ahead of the protests. It was difficult as a parent to know how to talk to their child about the protests because they weren't, didn't have any background on what the specific issues were. And then the specific examples that ended up in the paper were obviously very concerning, and there was no formal response context offered publicly addressing those specifics and what has been done to address them. So pause just to see if, I think as we've said, and, Javier, I don't know if, recognize, that the context leading up and the timeline for the communication on the front end was very challenging, and was, just the evening ahead of the event. So we recognize, that could have been better in a different situation and could have prepared families to engage with their students in different ways. Again, as we said, we were, trying to respond in the moment, during the days leading up to it, to respond and support students as we became aware of, their level of frustration, I guess we'd say. Recognize that communication on the front end, now looking back, certainly could have been improved and could have been more timely in ways. And we've been working to try and balance communicating clearly, and sharing information about, the various specifics. We have, one of the structures we have in place at all of our second, middle, and high schools is that we have what we call our building-based liaisons that are connected to our policy around student harassment, discrimination. And so we have followed up with all of the students from Lincoln who were maybe quoted or speaking about specific instances. So we're in the process. We have engaged with those students. Some of those were already previously known to us, others that are part of our work ongoing moving forward.
I just would add to that I don't know the specific examples that ended up in the paper. There were lots of articles and stories written, but the general themes that I summarized earlier are sort of the summaries of things that are being said by an adult to other adults, and to hear them come out of students is very moving, and there is a tremendous amount of pain and hurt that is accompanying that. So I think that the things that you read in the paper, to the extent that they were coming from the mouths of those students, reflect their real lived experiences. And, so they are, I think as they were described in this comment from Emily, that they're very concerning. They are very concerning. And so I think those are, that's why we take these extremely seriously and are, committed to building structures that break these cycles. And that's, I think, what we're trying to do. As I said earlier, there's nothing that we heard that we didn't have other data points that suggested it, but it's to hear it in that same way from students that is, it just ups the sense of urgency.
Yeah. The next question was around, what types of race or kind of equity trainings do teachers receive? Any thoughts to bringing in outside race equity organizations to facilitate district-wide training on these issues? Julio, you want to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So we launched in 2018 what we call our Equity Leaders Cohort. So we have educators from every building who were identified and do lead some of this work in partnership with administration in the building. So we've been partnering with the Center for Educational Equity to design kind of an arc of learning that's been over the course of multiple years. So some of the topics that we've done so far include understanding privilege, oppression, and implicit bias, systemic racism, colonization and Maine's Indigenous history, culturally responsive teaching, cross-difference communication, the belief gap, poverty, gender, immigration, structural oppression, educators of color, insights, difficult conversations, understanding the N-word, and our guidance around that, supporting LGBTQ community, equity and restorative practices, and many more. And then we've also done significant training for our administration. So every time we have a retreat or training, we spend at least half of our time doing pretty deep dives around our equity work, because our kind of primary, what we call adult learning target for our administration is becoming equity-oriented leaders. And so lots of those trainings have been in partnership with organizations that are here and local in Portland. So that hopefully that answers some of what we've done. I think a lot of the work we do in the instructional side of things, as well as in the classroom and school culture, also integrates equity explicitly. And I think something just transparently that we're working on is how to continually onboard new staff to the training we've done, because this has been for years. We've been rolling out training and trying to build common knowledge and common vocabulary that continues to kind of deepen and build. And so that's something we do onboard people, but I think that's a place where we've identified we want to get better. But hopefully that answers some of what we've done.
Can I just also add, because I think the question specifically was about external organizations to support our work, that, we've partnered from the very beginning in this work that Malia described with the Center for Educational Equity, which is a national organization based in the DC area that has been, thought partners and, co-designers and, often have helped, have led some of the professional development that Malia has talked about. And in addition to that, as you saw earlier, we've really, in response to the moment and the situation that we're here to talk about, have really redoubled our partnership with Seeds of Peace as an organization that is, an international organization, but that has a long-standing presence and tradition here in Portland to help us to, engage in constructive dialogue around these issues in ways that are across students and adults and, going forward. So I think that those are, examples of some of the external organizations that we've also partnered with.
One related question just to hit on quickly, building off the equity leaders. So, over the course of time, I don't have there's a question about who's part of that group at Lincoln Middle School. I don't have that.
I have that.
Oh, okay, great.
And Kathy, you can help, but I think Meg Rooks, I believe, Esby, Caleb, Franklin, and Andrea.
Mm-hmm.
I can put last names in.
Yeah. And I think, over the years, there have been other staff members that have been part of that cohort as well. And some of their responsibility, as part of the model is to come back and lead staff training. So there was, for example, this year, we rolled out guidance around how to address, instances of the use of the N-word that they led with the staff, and then additionally, there was an introductory restorative practices session, and then training around LGBTQ plus issues and awareness. So those were three of the main things that the equity cohort was focused on this year, that the equity leaders in partnership with Ms. Marquis Gerard and Ms. Bailey, had space and time for in professional development this year. Maybe I'll lump, one quick question. There was a question about whether we're, kind of recording this evening, and we'll share it. And so, yes, we are recording this evening's, forum, and we will, kind of post it on our district YouTube page and have a link accessible for folks moving forward who weren't able to join this evening, but would like to hear some of this background and information and context about what's happened and what's happening moving forward. So we have a couple of questions about, both kind of one question I would say about kind of how things are going kind of since then, so appreciations for taking time and space, kind of how is it going in the building, and some questions, kind of set of questions related to that around, what structures and supports are in place as we're closing the year to ensure effective, equitable, and restorative behavior strategies, and what happens when, folks are struggling to implement those and student behaviors don't improve. So I don't know if either Kathy or Gavin, you want to speak to some of that right now in terms of, how we're managing coming out of this. And go ahead, Kathy.
All right. So I'll start, and then Gavin, you can pick up, because we've had a change in our focus for the end of the year here as we get through. End of year is end of year stuff. There's always, changes going on. There's events that are going on. I think one of the biggest things is the incorporation of the focus groups and the work that they've done, and it's ongoing, is just fitting that into the day, what's already there. So I'm really excited about that work. I've worked with Tim Wilson from Seeds of Peace when I was at Portland High School, and they did some great work there. So I'm really all seeing that as positive steps. So I think kids are feeling that that's work and focus moving forward. We're still, also planning for the end of year celebration for the 8th graders. Today we welcome the 5th graders up to the middle school, and that hadn't been done in a couple of years now because of COVID. So it's very exciting to see all the 5th graders come in all excited, and we had students leading around some of the activities. So great work around that. So that's on some of the day-to-day stuff that's happening. And Gavin, maybe you can talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing directly with students in the focus groups and the restorative practices that we're continuing to, put in place for current incidences that we have, and just repairing some of the relationships that we're seeing between students. And
Yeah, thanks, Kathy and Aaron. Yeah, echoing everything they said about what we're trying to do. I mean, in my role, I spent most of my time with eighth grade, but varying amounts of time with sixth grade and seventh grade, and really trying to listen to students, really trying to understand their experience, especially our students of color, and hopefully trying to end the year strong for them and set them up for success going into high school, but also trying to understand what needs to happen to help repair relationships with staff in the building at the other grade levels for students who will continue to be at Lincoln, the sixth and the seventh graders, the incoming fifth graders. So lots and lots of listening going on, lots and lots of thinking, and we're planning out our steps in measured ways, trying to know, hopefully next week, start bringing staff and students together even more. In terms of restorative conversations, some of that work has begun with staff and students where, we are trying to rebuild trusting and respectful relationships in places where those have been damaged by bringing staff and students to the table to speak to one another, to listen to each other, hear each other. One thing we've heard from lots of students is, they feel like they're talked at and not listened to, and they're not part of the process. And so we're trying to make them feel that way, but also staff, it's very helpful for them to feel heard by students as well. So trying to create these two-way streets of communication has been going well, obviously, not quickly enough, but slowly but surely, and trying to plant those seeds around the building. So there are lots of other details we could get into, but that's the high level stuff.
Yeah. There was a related question just around.
I forgot to mention one other thing, which is student-to-student interactions, helping to repair those relationships and have restorative conversations with students when there are, misunderstandings, when there are altercations, etc. So I forgot that important piece.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the other things I would add too is that I hear from the students the concerns were just the consistency of some rules, the consistency across the board, and what their perceptions of that. And part of that comes out of too, when we look at dealing with students in harassment situations, and FERPA doesn't often allow us to have these long conversations specifically about how we handle things with other students. But I think that's a valid point. And that's one of the things that I think we really need to look at is our ability to have these restorative conversations between kids, but also to come full circle and be a little bit more transparent about that. So if kids are feeling that they've been heard and it's been handled, I think that's something I heard from students. And I think that's something we can also focus on.
And I will say, and just want to acknowledge and recognize, that it's a challenge and has been throughout the year, to, make that kind of cultural shift, particularly with the many stresses and strains that have been true this year in terms of challenges around staffing, and just continuing to have to respond to kind of the COVID context and the experiences that students had for the past couple of years, either through remote learning and hybrid learning. So it's been a very challenging climate, and we're working just with a few short school days to both try and begin to grow that work or expand that work, because I know, that it's not brand new work at Lincoln in terms of efforts in that regard. And, keep, recognizing the disruption really that the protest was, and some transitions, continuing to ensure safety and kind of order to have a productive and safe end of the school year. So, we're excited about these things. There's many great folks at Lincoln who are continuing to lean in to support students in this way, and, recognize that it's going to continue to take some time to grow that culture. So there was a question kind of about, why hasn't there been work to kind of deepen that over the course of the year? And I think we, recognize district-wide, that this is a body of work that we're trying to grow, not just at Lincoln, but at many of our schools, both elementary, middle, and high school, to create a culture that, is centered around restorative practices. And so our goals through the equity leaders this year was, in that training, was to be able to establish some shared understanding of what we mean, so that as we move forward, we can kind of begin to build capacity and deepen around those practices. So we recognize, just the tensions of the urgency to accelerate that work with the challenges of time and capacity to really ground it and kind of have it aligned with the equity mindsets that we've been working to cultivate over the past number of years. So recognize there's a significant amount of work to do. Appreciate, the staff's, kind of request, demand for more and deeper training. And that's definitely, a clear focus as we move forward. One other thing, just on a related note, as I'm just trying to manage the questions here. There was a question around future support work, entailing discussions with some of the protesters who are asking for respect, but it may also be for some students who have engaged in either harassing, bullying behavior as well themselves. And so part of what we have, some of the groups that have been mentioned this evening are really intended to be what we would refer to as kind of like a tier 2 group to provide some of those supports. So those Seeds of Peace groups and others are intentionally designed to try and support that group of students as we move forward, both to hear and to build understanding around behaviors and how we move forward together as a community, and to be able to hold that space. It's time intensive and labor intensive, but the work that needs to be done. So that is definitely on the radar, both for the short term as we're closing the year, but ongoing as needs into next year. I want to acknowledge kind of a question statement as well around equities, just not color, culture, and gender, and the work that we have to do to include and recognize, our students with disabilities as part of that conversation, and that needs to be another kind of core component of what it means for us when we talk about equity and inclusion and recognition of that. So I want to acknowledge that, recognize that doesn't show up as consistently maybe as it should in our framing and kind of discussion around it, and that's work that we have responsibility for continuing to build shared understanding and expand, our understandings around. Let me see. There's a couple of questions that were maybe kind of staffing related that I can just name a little bit. One was a question about whether Miss Bailey's returning as AP, and just more details about why the principal and office staff kind of felt the need to leave campus. Okay, you want to handle this? Sure.
Yeah. So Miss Bailey will, she is currently on leave, and we will need to talk to her when she is able to come back from leave to figure out what the appropriate placement will be. It's largely a personnel matter, so not something that can be discussed, broadly, but, we are cognizant of our obligations as she is of her obligations, and we will, engage when she's able to return from her leave. Regarding the decision to leave, I think as you heard when we presented on it, there are, it was a fairly charged and confusing time. So we don't have a clear understanding of exactly what motivated them to leave the building. We are in the process working with our team to investigate all of the circumstances leading up to that. And, we'll factor that into the decisions that we make going forward. So there is an ongoing investigation around that we will, that we will use as it becomes final.
In a different way, there are a couple other staffing ones that I think I'll try and kind of group together here a little bit. There were a couple of questions related to some staff turnover over the course of the year, both concern that students may be getting a message that they were to blame for teachers leaving, and just how we're managing with some of that, kind of turnover. So, one, I can speak to some of that last, and then Kathy, I don't know if you want to speak to any of that as well. I mean, there have been a variety of reasons, and not just at Lincoln. So please understand, that these have been challenges that we've seen at a number of schools in terms of staffing over the course of the year. However, we have backfilled, with, either long-term subs or interns, for all of those positions. So there aren't positions that are remaining open and vacant. We have adults in place. And again, as I've named, we've have allocated time and attention from additional central office staff to be able to support, to ensure, we can maintain, safety and use this from certainly a challenging moment and opportunity, but to respond to, the both student and staff desire to use this as a moment to start to build forward and develop, begin, and I emphasize begin, because I don't think we'll accomplish this in, the 14 days of school that remained, or how many ever it was following the protest, that this will be ongoing work for us in the Lincoln community in the coming year. But, despite that, to begin some of this process of healing and safety and have space for dialogue, as we've been talking about.
And I would just add that the staff has done an incredible job of helping cover when we've had out and lending a hand where what is many, many times. So they've been great about being flexible. So have appreciated all their efforts, keeping the building covered and make sure that positions of people who have been out ill are taken care of and filled in on a daily basis. So,
yeah. Yep. I'll just keep going there. A shout out and recognition here. One, for staff's concern and passion for participating in this work. So recognition of that here kind of as a comment, and looking forward to, engaging with them. And again, that invite for the community dialogue, is open to all staff, all families, and look forward to those opportunities for engagement. So just wanted to recognize that and hear that. And there was, a similar shout out here of, the good work that, one parent was attesting to seeing the Lincoln staff doing this year, and some of the great curriculum that builds on the district's equity work. There were, a question about how were the rules, quote unquote, of the protest communicated to all of the students who were involved. Many report that they were not told these guidelines. So go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, I would say they were communicated through the Lions Pride and through announcements and through the leadership. So there were, in my understanding and my experience was that there were several ways that those were communicated to students. I don't know why some students did feel that they weren't told ahead of time, but they were clearly marked and clearly designed and working with the student leaders and with Robin. So yeah.
And recognize, I think, as we've said, given the short turnaround, and the timeline, that led to some of that confusion, and that was real, and was one of the challenges we faced certainly that day.
And I think that maybe some kids might have been out sick. Like you said, it was a short turnaround time. So, and it could have been a Lions Pride teacher that wasn't in. We had a sub. So, yeah, I'm sorry that is unfortunate if some kids didn't feel that they heard the rules and were aware of them.
Mm-hmm. There's just a request to share a copy of the survey with parents. And so, we're happy to do so. We'll include a copy of the survey we've been referencing. So families know what kind of information we were gathering. So we'll include that in an upcoming communication so folks have access to that. I guess, what is being done to address staff who are being accused of racist behavior or language use. So, they're definitely, we are working through, if that is the case, we are engaging with students and staff about that specific context. We've been engaging with, students in terms of their experience and hearing from them, working again, as Gavin and Kathy have framed, where appropriate, and possible to hold space for repairing that harm. And, that's, again, what we're seeking to try and model. And, we have clear expectations, around, that being inappropriate behavior and unprofessional behavior. And so, in addition to that body of work as well, when appropriate, utilizing kind of our personnel systems, right, to address those, any instances that come up like that. Let me see. There was a kind of a technical question around explaining FERPA to parents on the call. I've spoken with several parents since the protest who'd never heard of FERPA. Maybe does somebody want to respond to that?
I can try. FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and it basically is a law that governs how student records are shared with people. And so it basically says that only school officials with a need to know, that's the term that is in the law, have access to information about even students in their care. And I think you will hear often that our staff will say, I can't tell you what happened to another student because of their right to privacy. And that's the right to privacy that's enshrined by the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. So it's there to ensure that, that we don't gossip, if you will, about students and student circumstances. And so it is, I know in the administration world that, one of the things that we struggle with all the time is parents wanting to know what happened to the other kid. And you'll often hear us say that we can't share that information with you. And that's primarily driven by the by the rights that are enshrined in FERPA and our need to preserve the privacy of other students.
Yeah. So there's a couple questions maybe that I can try and kind of group and maybe invite you, Kathy and Gavin, if you want to respond to these. So there's a question around kind of efforts to when a student is kind of continuously bullying others and what efforts we're making to kind of address that. Similarly, or in a related way, how are staff and admin responding when challenging behaviors arise? Is there a consistent approach? And I think there's one other, maybe I'll pause there for a moment. So
I'll grab the first one about bullying and harassment. One of our biggest challenges is social media. And that has been a challenge because often kids will interact on a variety of different social media platforms and be downright mean and some things that they're saying to one another. And sometimes that happens, outside of school, but it gets brought into school because the kids are sitting next to each other. And so these things are sort of festering. So it has been an increasing challenge, I think, for all schools. And talking with my colleagues across the middle schools and others, it's one of those challenges. And so just when you think, we've done some restorative practices and somebody else goes in and there's some posts that's made, then so I know that schools having phones and having students having phones and having access to that has been really challenging. So, it's we try to take each case and try to be consistent with it. Let's look at all the variables, see things in the context in which it happens. And, we have a off and away policy, but that is a challenge for kids. And so they're oftentimes using the social media. Sometimes during school, we try to monitor that all the time, but it also that's where they live, and that's this big social piece for them. And so I think it's hard, and there's so many different ways they can do things anonymously, and to hide in chat rooms and stuff disappears, and so it is quite a challenge. I think it's bullying and harassment has been an ongoing thing in middle schools. And it's, we're trying different strategies and different approaches. And And we're going to focus, one of the things that we're hoping to focus on is through common sense media about citizenship, digital citizenship, and some of the focus on that, looking at adding that to the curriculum and addressing kids. And I know both Gavin and I are really a big proponent of restorative practices and repairing those relationships and having those conversations with it face to face, and teaching them explicitly how to have difficult conversations. And when you've stepped over the line, how do we restore that? And that's really a true measure. A student is just I tell them it's true measure of your character is not that you made the mistake. It's how we address the mistake. And it's the same for adults. How do we step up and have those difficult conversations and try to restore the relationship again in a positive way? So, Gavin, you could talk a little bit more about what you've been doing on the day-to-day here.
I think with bullying and harassment, to echo Kathy's point about restorative practices, the focus is on repairing the harm done to people and relationships rather than on punishing the offenders. And so, this is I think a shift for many people that we're, trying to introduce because there are, students and adults and who would like to focus on consequences. And while there certainly are consequences in time, then there's a time and place for them. The best way to root out the bullying and harassment is to repair harm done and to build strong relationships to prevent further occurrences later. Unfortunately, these are things that we deal with on a regular basis, and I feel like we are making real progress with students. And so, time will tell how successful we are, but I think, we are in a place right now where we are seeing some of the positive results of our efforts, and hope to continue those practices.
There was a question around, and maybe this relates just if you want to expand on this, about, some of the themes that motivated the protest were similar to ones that, kind of have been known, throughout the year. I know the superintendent, you spoke to this some, so just questions about how we've been, not just in this current moment, but throughout the year, been active in trying to address some of those concerns. So, I don't know. Kathy, if you want to offer anything there, but I think, some of your last response in terms of how you've been managing throughout the year have been efforts to, try and address, and respond to some of these issues and create some spaces for, student dialogue and discourse. But obviously, we recognize and kind of take responsibility that there's much more to do, and that we have, that the frustration that was evident is feedback that there's much more work to do to create the kinds of spaces and ongoing relationships that, will be able to provide the kind of healthy and safe context in which we can talk about these difficult issues and be able to, create spaces where we're able to manage through when difficult things are happening. So I think.
Yeah. And I think again, I've been able to talking with Tim Wilson is looking, forward. So one of the things that we're looking at is how as we build these skills across the board, whether it's staff or between student to student, and then student empowerment on how they can be that voice of change. I think one of the things is how do we look? So for the 7th grade, one of the things that they're going to be focusing on is being trained in peer mediation. So similar to a model of, we have the main youth court up at Portland in the high school levels. So looking at, sustainability as far as practices and, changes to as a leader, how I approach things. It might be as far as how discipline goes, to approach things and how you incorporate student voice, which I think is critical in a school, and how you engage the staff in those conversations as well. And then how do you you teach children those same things, as well as model those things for kids, both at the adult level, but then so they can see that happening. And I think another piece here is the in using and involving parents. I think that's another key piece. We're a team. when it comes to this to also, and I noted a couple of comments here about, can you let us know so we can have those conversations at home? And I think that's another critical piece, is that parent engagement and community engagement about the work that we're doing so they can support it as well. So for the 7th grade, they're going to be trained to be peer mediators moving forward. And for the 8th grade, we're looking at them making that transition to high school. So a key piece is maybe some summer work and connecting with that high school and those students so that work can continue on, whether at any of our 3 high schools. And I think, I'm not sure that answers all the questions, but just that is the ongoing work. But, I think that it can really support this work as we move forward. Instead, would, do it differently. Maybe.
Let me just, I want to add something that's, sort of more broadly around this. I think I mentioned earlier that, it's very clear from the voices of our students that they're asking for more urgency on our part to be able to address the underlying issues that are there. And I just want to be clear that I know that sense of urgency also exists with the overwhelming majority of our staff. I have a tremendous amount of faith and belief in our staff's desire and ability to be able to address the moment. I also know that they have a strong sense of urgency around having the support and the knowledge and the resources to be able to do that work. And that is where, this is not what Lincoln did or didn't do, but it's what we as a school district do to enable Lincoln and all of our buildings to be able to move that work forward. And while you heard, some of the good things that we've put in place, I think the clear message coming from these situations is that it is, that we need to do more, and we need to do it faster, and we need to do it with, a sense of urgency to be able to, change circumstances and change students' lives. And I know our staff want to do that, and it's our job as a district administration to be able to help them to do that.
Thanks. Just a couple more, just to, want to kind of respond. A couple questions, that I'll group together around, kind of both restoring trust, given what people may have experienced around, seeing folks, kind of leave, and how their folks are being assured that no students are kind of going to be retaliated against. So I think, just building off what Superintendent Botana said, I want to again shout out the many vast, overwhelming majority of staff who continue to show up for kids, showed up on that day, were with them throughout the day, and continue to be there because of their commitment and desire. And so I think, as we've seen, even as we've navigated this, there still remain folks adults in the building that they trust, that they feel confident in, and feel safe with. And so, I know that that's one of the pieces that's been able to kind of sustain, but recognize, and we've tried to lean in and build relationships in short order too, to help kind of respond to that and ensure, that recognize the day for what it was in terms of, the expression of those frustrations, and continue to try and have space to build and move forward around those. Let me see, we may not, there were a couple shout outs I was saving here just around, somebody shouting out the 6th grade teachers, and their 6th grader having a great experience during the initial part of the protest. So I want to just give voice to that. And, another kind of impressed by the work of Lincoln teachers all year, as well by the diversity and breadth of the PPS curriculum for middle schoolers. So hoping that the educators are continuing to be supported through this difficult year. So I want to make sure to give voice to those as well. There are a couple of last minute comments coming in that I'll try and get to here before we close in just a minute. I think there was kind of a clarifying question about, when things shifted and kind of, as we said, the plans went what was supervision like, beyond that time, and just want to ensure that folks know that there were never, that a number of staff, Ms. Markey-Gerard, myself, a number of other, ed techs and counselors remained outside and with kids at all times. So, for students that remained around, staff remained present, throughout that time. So, just wanted to kind of clarify, and certainly that was working to kind of de-escalate. And by the 2:00, we either had a small group that was waiting for a bus ride home, or other students who had, we'd been able to contact parents and they had been able to begin to make their way home. So we recognized the gap in communication that was not part of the plan and was a real challenge that day. And we had many staff, stepping up still in those moments to provide supervision as best we could. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just kind of tracking through the last few. Last few questions here. So appreciations around thinking about the peer mediation support. There's been a model that's been built out at Casco, that has some opportunity to grow down in the middle schools. There's a question around communicating the process for reporting discrimination and harassment, and that's, and kind of being explicitly taught that. So certainly work that needs to grow and improve to ensure everybody is aware of the various means of reporting. So recognize that, and I think there's, a few questions here that kind of touch on, how to just manage, and some of the earlier ones in this transition when there are challenging behaviors, right? And how it is we're showing up and to respond to ensure student and staff safety and to be able to create a climate that, allows all students to be successful. We know the, really unfortunate outcomes that come from kind of punitive discipline models. And I think, I just want to acknowledge there's some transition there in capacity building that we need to provide staff to be able to support that work and build their understanding. Just as the superintendent said, the will is there. And so it's our work to be able to kind of grow that skill and capacity to respond in those ways. And that's the body of work in front of us, both as we're closing this year and addressing, ongoing behavior challenges, but also as we move forward into the coming year. So, I don't know if anybody else or Malia from a kind of system-wide perspective, if there's anything you want to offer about, because I think our work at Lincoln is representative of, work we're trying to do across, these needs that we experience at Lincoln, I think as we've named are not, as evidenced by the concerns from students at Lyman Moore, are not unique to Lincoln. So.
I don't think I have much to add, Aaron, other than what you said. We've been working on plans for next year, in addition to the response to kind of where we're at right now. And we have a big collaboration with our director of behavioral and mental health and the folks working on that body of work with our director of equity and inclusion. So that's one of our two primary sort of goals and areas of focus for next year. So that's something that we're working on system-wide. I think part of our vision is that starting in elementary, students are learning practices so that by the time they're getting to middle school and ultimately high school, we have a lot of those habits and that language and all of that. And it's working in some places at different schools, but it's our intention to make that very systematic and sort of deeply ingrained aspect of our culture.
Yeah. Just want to acknowledge, a challenge and attention all year as like we have leaned into the equity work and are trying to manage, this transition in terms of, how we approach student behavior and how staff may experience, at times, kind of feedback back from students in terms of how they are trying to, either assert authority or not, and navigating the kind of complexity of the students that they're serving, right, and who may be of different backgrounds, and than their own, and that's part of the ongoing kind of training and support work. We definitely has become kind of forefront this year in a way that that hadn't I think had been there probably before, but I think we've seen, kind of a more pronounced need. And that's part of the ongoing training and support, that's incumbent upon us to help support our educators in the school. So the one quick clarifying question, maybe just before we kind of close out, and see some appreciations for the opportunity to kind of learn more and hear this tonight. And again, encourage folks to RSVP for the dialogue so that this can move from us talking to you to us talking together around these issues. But there was a question about were teachers able to protest with students to show that they felt supported. And so I know there were some teachers who had time at times to be out there, but, want to recognize, and I think a reflection on our part is, we expected school to go on, following that period of time. And we wanted teachers in the building to be able to kind of do that. And so, I think that was potentially challenging for teachers at times who did want to show support and solidarity with students, while at the same time recognizing, that we were communicating an expectation of being in their classrooms, continuing to provide instruction through the rest of the day. And so, recognize that may have been challenging at times. And, Javier, I know we've reflected on this. So if you want to add anything.
I think that consistently, that's also true at Moore, that one of the, reflections that we've had is that our clear desire and need to preserve instruction for students who didn't join the protest clashed with many teachers' desire to show solidarity and support. And teachers have told us that they felt that as a result of that they appeared to be unsupportive when in fact they were supportive of what the students were bringing forward. So I think, we've learned from that, and something that we would do differently if we were ever in the situation again.
And just the last one here before we close is, recognizing kind of student union that might incorporate students from various backgrounds. So definitely, I know that the civil rights team is one place where that can happen, but definitely continue to grow those opportunities for student leadership and student voice in different ways, and building alliances across the student community and student and staff community. That is the work moving forward. So yes, we see the value in lots of those kinds of configurations to be able to provide space that is, diverse and across difference, as well as to create spaces for students, where who have a particular experience that may share some particular experiences of the world based on their identity and lived experience, to also be able to process what it means to be a student like that in our community. So we see value in both of those kinds of spaces, and seek to support that in many ways.
And I'll add to that I think that's one of the reasons that we're excited to be partnering with Seeds of Peace, because Seeds of Peace entire sort of curriculum and way of working, and even their sort of origins and existence is built around those cross identities work. And so I think that, that is a reflection of what we want, what we want to be as a community and as a district. I will also say that, it's been very clear as we've been in this this period of time, that one of the things that has happened is that at the middle schools in particular, we've been and largely as a result of the pandemic, and I know that the pandemic is blamed for many things, but this is one that has become very obvious, that as a result of the pandemic, some of the existing leadership structures that were in place in our middle schools have not endured, and that has been a challenge. And I think one of the reasons that, students were trying to find a place to let us know about these things, those structures weren't there to enable us to hear them on an ongoing and regular basis. And so that's a missed opportunity for us, something that we need to repair going forward.
Well, we recognize we're a few minutes over time, but wanted to get through all of the questions. So again, want to invite people moving forward to continue to reach out, to us individually, as appropriate if we can support in any way. And again, invite everybody and hope you bring somebody else along with you to the community dialogue on June 9th in the evening in person at Lincoln, where we'll have the opportunity to engage together, right? And we're really looking forward to that as a building block, as we connected with some parent leaders of these are initial steps to move forward. None of this is going to be accomplished in a meeting. And it's about kind of some shared values that we hear clearly from students, from staff, and from parents, and, leaning into that to continue to grow the Lincoln community in the coming weeks and in the coming years. So.
And I just want to thank everybody for being here. As I started the session today, apologizing, this is not why we should be getting together at the end of the year. And I know that this has been an incredibly stressful time for our families and for our students. So I want to extend again my apologies for that. I also know that it's been stressful for many of the people on the screen and for our staff, our teachers in ed techs and others in the schools. And so, I'm incredibly grateful for people's continued efforts and commitment to showing up even in these really hard times, and just, extend a special appreciation to Kathy, to Gavin, to Aaron, as people who are, here on the screen that are representing the people that are at our, at Lincoln every day, continuing to move the work forward as we try to end the school year that has been an incredibly difficult school year on a positive note. And then I also want to thank our interpreter friends, who I know we have been terrible to you guys today, because this was less scripted than some of our other meetings. I know that we were terrible, and thank you guys for always showing up for this and managing through. Even when I see, Nanette telling me to slow down and I'm just going a mile a minute. So thank you all.
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you on a daily basis. The amount of times I've made the call and you guys have always responded in times, and get when you get my number flash up. And I just have appreciated your professionalism and your support and your good work with parents and families and the kids. And you just didn't do an incredible job, and it makes me really proud to be here at Portland. But I just be proud to be associated with you guys. Are great. So thank you again so much.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all. We'll look forward to seeing you, as we close out the school year. Look forward to seeing 8th grade families at the 8th grade celebrations. And then, look forward to hopefully seeing many of you at the community dialogue on June 9th. So have a wonderful evening, everybody.